Hello, and welcome to the second half of Chapter 4 for macroeconomics on unemployment and inflation. So, we have already looked at unemployment in class, and this video will just help to go through the rest of Chapter 4 on inflation. So, first off, what is inflation? Well, inflation is a persistent rise in the general level of prices. And we know that sometimes we call it the cost of living. Cost of living increases. Well, that's inflation, slowly and persistently inflating prices of goods and services. And it's one thing that we want to make sure, as economists, that we have inflation under control. And we'll see why shortly. The inflation is measured using a price index, and the most widely used ones are the consumer price index, which uses a basket of goods and services that a household family of four may buy throughout an entire year. And those same items are checked year after year after year to see how much the price has gone up. And that's how we figure out inflation. The other one is the GDP deflator, which literally uses our GDP to help calculate inflation. So we'll talk about those a little bit more. The CPI, Consumer Price Index, and the GDP deflator tend to move together most of the time. The GDP deflator is the price of goods produced in Canada, and the CPI is the price of goods consumed. These are measured using different goods. One key thing here, or a couple key things: hyperinflation. So hyperinflation, this is something you never want to have happen in your economy. It's when inflation is increasing at a dramatically fast rate. So very high inflation from an increase in the price level. And inflation comes from money growth, which we'll talk about a little bit more in chapter 8. Um, in terms of hyperinflation, two really good examples of it. Germany after World War One, when all the Allied nations gave Germany a bill for all the damages that they had done during the war. And the only way that Germany could try and pay for that was to increase their money supply, which led to hyperinflation and extreme poverty within Germany. It was not a good time, and it actually really set the stage for the rise of the Nazi Party. Um, the other example, which is more recent, is Venezuela. And Venezuela, this happened in the 2000s. Uh, they had started to get hyperinflation, and it got to the point that in Venezuela, prices were doubling every 25 hours. And this was just in 2008. They had inflation rates of 65,000%. So uh, an item that cost $1, if it went through all that inflation, all of a sudden that same item costs $650. And what it did was it devalued Venezuela's money, and by devaluing the money, uh, it just made it worthless outside of Venezuela, and Venezuela couldn't keep up with the money the way and the prices the way they were going because inflation was going so crazy. It was to the point that if you went out to a restaurant to eat, prices would actually change during your meal. That's how quickly prices were increasing. And both those examples, Germany and Venezuela, was due to increasing the money supply. So the government had increased the money supply, and they increased it to such a rate that hyperinflation kicked in. Not a good scenario. The other one that you really don't want is deflation, and that's negative inflation. And it sounds good, but because your prices are coming down, but it has some drastic consequences and really hard to get out of once you're in it. Japan has been in a state of deflation for almost 2 decades now. Um, and part of the reason is as prices are dropping, people tend to stop spending money, and so do businesses. They're trying to hold off buying things because they know that the prices are going to go down. So they're trying to wait on any major purchases until prices go down, and then they'll do it. But since prices are always going down, you keep putting those on hold because you want to save money. Um, and so it's a very difficult situation to get out of. So those are two extreme cases of inflation. All right. So macroeconomic theory tells us that the growth in the money supply causes inflation in the long run. Long run inflation is very costly as it tends to reduce employment, output, and consumption. And since inflation is caused in the long run by money growth, the central bank determines the long run inflation rate through its control of the rate at which the money supply grows. Um, so, in the long run, as prices increase, prices of goods and service start to increase across the board, and what that does is it erodes away at our real income or purchasing power as consumers. Prices go up, our wages haven't gone up, and so we can now afford to only buy less than what we could before. And as wages start to go up to kind of compensate for that, what ends up happening is businesses, uh, they see their profit margins start to shrink. Sometimes they reduce their supply. Other times they pass on those costs to the consumer and increase the prices again, which is inflation. And so inflation can just continue on if it's not kept in check. It's a vicious circle. As prices go up, then wages have to go up to kind of match those prices. And now we're passing those increased costs on to the consumer, which increases the prices again. So inflation is a vicious circle. Surprise or unexpected increases in the rate of inflation can cause short run increases in employment, and that's part of the Phillips curve, which we'll see next, and output. But the long run costs really exceed the short run benefits. And really, the reason being here, why we can have a short run increase in employment is normally the price of goods and services increases due to inflation before uh, wages start to increase. So, companies, when prices increase, they'll use what they already have in inventory in terms of supplies and materials. Um, and they've bought those at a lower price, and wages haven't gone up yet. So, they can produce and actually make more profit in the short run. But eventually, they need to go back out and buy supplies to produce their products or perform their services. And when they do that, they have to pay the new increased price for those. So even if they do hire employees in the short run to take advantage of the profit, the increased profit margin, it's a very, very short term and short lived um, tactic, because eventually they have to go out and start buying supplies again, which will increase their costs, reduce their profit, and as well, because of inflation and the cost of everything going up, consumers are buying less of everything. It then leads to excess inventories, firms laying people off. So your unemployment rate uh, starts to increase as well as your inflation rate increases. So here's the Phillips curve, and we can see up here if the inflation rate goes up, and this is, remember, this is very, very short term. So as the inflation rate increases, unemployment in the short term will increase while firms try and take advantage of that increased profit margin. But it's very, very short term because, as I said, then they have to start paying increased costs for their supplies and goods, natural resources, and eventually labor rates as well will go up. So in the short term, if we have a unexpected kind of bump in inflation, poof, firms can capitalize on a little excess profit. And a lot of times that'll reduce the unemployment rate temporarily while firms try and take advantage of that increased profit. But then it'll catch up. So this is just kind of the Phillips curve is just showing the short term impacts of increased and decreased inflation. Measuring inflation. Well, there's two different ways we can measure the inflation. We can use the consumer price index or the GDP deflator. We're going to start with the consumer price index first, or CPI for short. And the CPI is a measurement of the average level of prices of the goods and services that a typical Canadian family consumes. And it's actually based on a family of four, um, and what they would consume in a year. So there's set items in the basket of goods, as we call it, and the cost of the basket in a given year divided by the cost of the basket in a base year times 100 will give us our inflation rate. Or will give us our CPI index, sorry. And then we can find our inflation rate from there. So in Canada, the year 2002 is the base year that they use for most of the CPI goods. And so you go and you find out what those goods cost now compared to what they cost in 2002. And that's how they figure out the CPI index. Once you have your index, all we have to do to find our inflation rate is we'll take our index in year two minus our index in year one, or the previous year, and divide that by the index in year one and multiply it by 100 to put it into a percentage, and we'll find out what our inflation rate is. So, um, when the government of Canada tries to measure inflation, they do it with CPI and as well with the GDP, but they also measure what's called core inflation. And what it does, core inflation just excludes items with highly volatile prices. So, fruits and vegetables, gas, fuel oil, mortgage interest, and tobacco can all have volatile prices. So, they take those out of the equation. And what this does, it gives us a better indication of underlying long term inflation rates on products and services that aren't volatile in their price. So it just gives us a better idea of the underlying long term inflation rate. The other method we can use is the GDP deflator. And the GDP deflator is a measure of the price level of goods and services included in the GDP. So, the GDP deflator, if we want to figure out what the GDP deflator is, it's just going to be our nominal GDP divided by our real GDP times 100. And that's going to give us our GDP deflator index. We can rearrange this to find for any one of the variables. So if we know two variables, if we know GDP deflator uh, and nominal GDP, we can find real GDP by using the third formula. Or if we know the GDP deflator and the nominal GDP, if we know GDP deflator and the real GDP, we can use the second formula to find nominal GDP. And if we know the GDP deflator and we know the nominal GDP, we can use the third formula just to find the real GDP. So as long as we know two out of the three of those variables, we can find the third using one of these formulas. It's just the same formula. It's just been kind of rearranged in order to solve for the different variables. So if we compare the two ways we measure inflation, the CPI, Consumer Price Index, and the GDP deflator, here's what we'll see. The CPI is an explicit index using a constructed bundle of consumer goods. So, what we mean by an explicit index is we know exactly what is included in the CPI. We know exactly which goods because we use the same goods year after year after year. Compared to the GDP deflator, which is an implicit index measuring the ratio of nominal to real GDP. Since it uses GDP, we don't always know what is exactly in it. We just know it's the GDP. For the CPI, the bundle of goods remains constant. They use the same goods year after year after year to measure inflation. For the GDP deflator, since it's measured by the GDP, the bundle of goods changes each year. The CPI does not include capital or government goods and services. It only looks at household goods and services. Compared to the GDP deflator, because it's a measure of GDP, it includes capital and government goods and services. The CPI does include imported goods because in a regular household, when you go out and you shop, a lot of times you end up buying imported goods. You may not realize you're doing it, but you do. Um, where the GDP deflator actually excludes imported goods because we use net exports, which is our exports minus our imports to measure our GDP. So it excludes imported goods. So, two different ways of measuring inflation, and generally they'll follow the same path, but you'll often get slightly different numbers in terms of the inflation rate depending on which measure you use, and that's because of the differences between them. All right, test your understanding. So fill in the blanks to one decimal place here for the years 2015, 2016, and 2017. So in 2015, we're given the nominal GDP and the real GDP. We need to calculate out the GDP deflator. And we can see we're using a base year of 2010. And then we've got the population. So once we've got, or we can also find our real GDP per capita. So we know our real GDP and we know our population. Remember, the GDP numbers are in billions of dollars. The population's only in millions of dollars. So you got to keep that in mind for your calculations. 2016, we just need to find our real GDP per capita. Once again, keep in mind our GDPs in billions of dollars, our population in millions of dollars. And then for 2017, we're going to use our GDP deflator formula here. We're going to have to rearrange it to solve for real GDP, and then we'll find a real GDP per capita. So I encourage you to pause the video here and try these on your own. And then once you're ready, hit play and we'll take a look at the answers together. All right, so let's take a look at the answers. So the GDP deflator for 2015, if we wanted to find that, all we did was take our nominal GDP, divide it by our real GDP, and when we did that, we would have got 118.4. So that's the GDP deflator index. Excuse me. For the next part, when we want to find real GDP per capita, remember we have 26.1 million people, but we're talking about billions of dollars. So we have to get this into the same units. So the way we're going to do that is we just have to remember to put them in the same units. So our real GDP is 374 billion, and we're going to divide that by 0.0261 billion because that's what 26.1 million is. It's 0.0261 billion. So when we do that, we should get a real GDP per capita in 2015 of 14,329.5. So once again, if you wanted to look at it, when we put this into billions, it becomes 0.0261 billion. So now we're in billions. And you'll have to do that for 2016 and 2017 as well. All right, so let's take a look at 2016. We want to find the real GDP per capita. So our real GDP is 389 billion. Our population has grown a little bit. We're now at 0. Here, I'm just going to put that in 0.0264 billion. Might as well do this one too. 0. So in billions, this is what our population looks like. So we'll just take our real GDP. We're going to divide it by our population, and that's going to give us our real GDP per capita, which in this case is going to work out to 14,734.8 per person in terms of real GDP. So uh, we're going to 2017 now. We're doing our last little bit here. We're going to rearrange our GDP deflator formula. We know what the GDP deflator is, we know what nominal GDP is. So we can use that now to find our real GDP. And just in case you've forgotten that, I'm just going to flip back up here. Uh, Real GDP is equal to our nominal GDP divided by the GDP deflator times 100. So that's what we're going to do. And when we do that, we should get a real GDP of 402. So all we did there is 507 divided by our GDP deflator of 126.1, and it gave us 402 once we multiplied it by 100. Now that we know our real GDP, once again, we're going to find our real GDP per capita. So just have to remember that is going to be 0.027 billion. So they're in the same unit. So 402 divided by 0.027, and that's going to give us our real GDP per capita. And our real GDP per capita is $14,888.90. So we can see our real GDP per capita, which is a real good measure of economic growth, shows that we've been slowly increasing in our real GDP per capita. So we've had some steady growth. We can look at inflation here as well, and we can see we've had inflation during this time, according to the GDP deflator. All right, so let's continue on. We're going to kind of continue to follow this path here of finding out our real income in this section. So, nominal versus real income. Using a price index will allow us to compare past incomes or other money values with present incomes. So, our nominal income, that's what we're currently making, the present dollar value of a person's income. That's your current income. If you're making $50,000 per year, that is your nominal income. What we're interested in is what is our real income? And real income is really just the purchasing power of income. That is nominal income divided by the price level. So we're just adjusting for inflation when we figure out what our real income is. So we want to do that. If we want to find out what real income is in year B, all we're going to do is follow this formula here. We're going to take our nominal value in year A, divide it by the price index in year A, and then multiply it by the price index in year B or the base year. If it's the base year, you're just going to be multiplying it by 100. If you're using another year besides the base year, then you have to use that price index. So let's see how this works. Example, suppose we want to know the real value of our income based on 2002 prices. That's the CPI base year. If we currently make $50,000 per year and the price index is 136, that's the 2019 Consumer Price Index in Canada, then this is how we would calculate it. We want to find out what a real value of our income is in 2019. We're going to take our nominal income in 2019, divide it by the price level. So here we got our nominal income of 50,000 divided by the price level of 136 or price index of 136. And then we're going to multiply that by the price index in year B, which in this case is our base year, so it's just 100. Our base year index is always 100. So when we do that, we'll go and we'll find out, well, our real value of our income is $36,765, which means that even though we're making $50,000, that's the equivalent to making $36,765 in 2002. So we can see that our real value is much lower than our nominal value. Our purchasing power isn't as strong as we may think it is. All right. Let's go through a couple examples here. Etruria's nominal GDP rose from 42 billion in 2016 to 45 billion in 2017. During the same period, its inflation rate was 5%. So, by what percentage did nominal GDP increase? And for that, we're just going to use our growth rate. And then by what percentage did real GDP increase? And we're going to use our second formula for that. So give it a shot here. I encourage you to pause the video and give it a shot. And when you're ready, just press play and we'll take up the answers. All right, so let's take a look at the answer here. Oh, we know what nominal GDP was in both 2016 and 2017. So we can use that to figure out what the growth rate was or what percentage nominal GDP increased by. So 2017, we had 45 billion nominal GDP. We're going to subtract that from 2016 nominal GDP of 42 billion divided by 42 billion. And then we're going to multiply it by 100 to put it into a percentage. And when we do that, we're going to find out that our percentage increase in nominal GDP was 7.14%. Now, in order to do part B, we now have to look, and we know that the inflation rate was 5%, and we want to find out by what percentage did real GDP increase. So, in order to do that, all we're going to do is percent change in real GDP is equal to the percent change in nominal GDP minus our inflation rate. So we just calculated out what our percent change in nominal GDP was from 2016 to 2017, and that was 7.14%. And we know that the inflation rate was 5% during that period. So to find our percent change in real GDP, we just take the 7.14% that our nominal GDP increased by and subtract our inflation rate of 5%. And we'll find out that our real GDP actually only increased 2.14%. All right. Now we're just going to take a quick look at the rule of 70. What the rule of 70 actually does is it estimates the time it'll take for a figure to double in value given a certain percentage growth rate. So, if we want to find out, for example, how long it'll take prices of certain things to double, we can use this formula. It's also good for investments. So, you may have encountered this in business math already. To find out the number of years to double, all we're going to do is take 70 and divide it by the percent growth rate. And so, for example, $1,000 invested at 10% will double in 70 divided by 10, 7 years. So if we invested $1,000 at 10%, I'm assuming it's simple interest, then, or compounded yearly, let's say that, then all we do is we take our formula, 70 divided by our growth rate of 10% per year, and we'll find out that that investment will double in 7 years. So it's a good estimate for how long it'll take something to double if we have a steady growth rate. So if the inflation rate is 7%, and we're assuming here that it's going to stay at 7%, it's not going to change, how long will it take for prices to double? So we can just use our formula here. Number of years to double is going to be 70 divided by our percent growth rate. So I'm going to give you a couple seconds to do that, or pause the video if you want. And then when you're ready, press play and we'll look at the answer. All right, let's take a look at the answer here. So our inflation rate is 7%. We're just going to put that into our formula here. So number of years to double is going to be 70 divided by our growth rate of 7%. So 70 divided by 7, it tells us that, hey, if inflation is steady at 7%, it'll take 10 years for prices to double. So let's start taking a look at some of the costs of inflation. And there are some substantial costs of inflation. And the first one is redistributive costs. So, redistributive costs are just shifts in income from the economically weak to the economically strong. And inflation especially affects people who are on fixed income. So, if you're retired and you're on a fixed income, well, you've got a fixed income. That's a fixed amount of money. It's not going to increase or decrease. So if inflation increases, what it does is it erodes your purchasing power. And in 80s and 90s, over a course of, I think it was 85 to 92, it was, um, people who were on a fixed income found that their purchasing power got cut in half during that 7 year span because inflation was very high during those times. We've now done some things to make sure that the inflation rate shouldn't get as high as it used to. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the government controlling the money supply and really doing it through fixing the interest rates. So that's one example is people who are on fixed incomes get really hit hard by inflation. Another example of this is um, employees who are in a weaker bargaining position. So if you're working for an organization and it's not unionized, for example, you may find that uh, increases in the wages don't match inflation. So inflation is higher than any increases in wages. And what that does is it slowly erodes away of those people's purchasing power. They can't buy as much with the money they make because inflation is going up higher than their wages, which means that prices of products and goods and services are also increasing faster than their income. Um, if you happen to be in the right type of position, either a strong bargaining position, so unions a lot of times can keep their members' wages up with inflation, kind of on track or even a little bit above inflation. Um, or if you're in positions like sales, for example, if you're going out and you're selling more because a lot of times you get bonused on sales, a lot of times you can outpace inflation and still do quite well. And actually, the increased cost of the services and goods that you're selling can lead to even higher bonuses and keep you well above inflation. But those who are on a fixed income or in a weak bargaining position and whose wages don't increase at the same rate as inflation are going to be drastically affected by inflation. Another thing is it also shifts income from lenders to borrowers. So when you lend money out or a bank lends money out, they lend it out at a certain interest rate. And that interest rate accounts for inflation plus what we call the cost of borrowing, the money they make from lending out that money. So let's say that the bank loans you $1,000 at an interest rate of 7%. They're figuring that inflation is going to be at 3%. So the other 4% is just profit that they make from lending you the money, interest. But what happens is if inflation increases above 3%, say it goes to 5%, Well, then that takes away the cost of borrowing or the profit margins of the bank. They were expecting 3%, inflation's at 5%. They lent it out at 7%, so now they're only making 2% on their money. And in rare instances, if inflation increases even faster, say inflation goes to 8%, well, now the bank's actually losing money by lending it out because they lent it out at 7%. So it actually shifts income from lenders to the borrowers. The borrowers now are the benefactors of inflation, and the lenders lose out. Another cost of inflation is output costs. And output costs reduces the level of investment and economic growth. Um, Especially if inflation rates are unknown. If a business isn't sure what inflation's going to do, um, they may hold off on major investment projects until they're a little bit more certain of what's going to happen with inflation. It just might make the risk too great to go and pursue those investments. And so that's how it reduces the level of investment, and it for the same reasons it'll reduce economic growth because now those businesses aren't spending on investment, and because they're not spending on an investment, that reduces the GDP, so it can reduce economic growth as well. Not to mention that as inflation goes up, households' purchasing power goes down, and so now they're not purchasing as much, and so that's going to also slow economic growth. Another output cost is what's called menu costs. And menu costs are just the cost of revising catalogs, websites, and so forth to reflect new prices. And menu costs, especially if you do magazines, can or catalogs, that can be a substantial cost to a business. And so all of a sudden, if we have kind of surprised increase in inflation, and they have to increase their prices, they now have to spend money to reflect those increased prices on their catalogs and their websites. And that all takes time, especially if you've got a large business with hundreds or thousands of products that you sell. It takes time to go through and increase all those prices. So that's another increased cost of inflation. As well, it's going to reduce exports and increase imports. In Canada, if the inflation rate goes up, well, that makes Canadian products more expensive. And so, because Canadian products are now more expensive, other countries are less likely to buy our Canadian products in the form of exports, or they'll buy less of them. So, it's going to reduce our exports. And within Canada, when households go out to do their shopping, Canadian goods are going to be more expensive, so they might substitute them with imported products that aren't as expensive. So, inflation can have a real devastating effect because it can affect all levels outside of the government sector. It kind of affects them as well. But the business sector, they're not going to spend as much on investment, so they're not going to go out and do investment spending. As well, their costs of production are going up, so they might reduce their supply, um, or even engage in layoffs because of that. And so that's going to stem the economic growth from the business side. From the household side, if our wages aren't matching inflation, then we can't buy as much. Our purchasing power is decreased. So we're not spending as much normally either. And so from the household side, we see a reduction in economic growth as well. we don't see as much consumption. The foreign markets, our exports decrease, imports increase. So that's going to have a negative effect on our GDP and negative effect on economic growth. And even from the government sector, especially if businesses start laying people off, well, that means that the government doesn't get as much tax revenue because they're losing income tax from those people. And a lot of times they end up increasing the amount of transfer payments in the form of EI, welfare, CERB, even. They increase those transfer costs as well. So it takes away from government spending. So can inflation can really just stall out an economy if it's not carefully monitored. Galloping inflation, also called hyperinflation. We talked about this already, but extremely high rates of inflation. And examples: Germany after World War One, prices rose by 5,470% in 1922 and 1.3 trillion times in 1923. The economy absolutely collapsed. High rates of unemployment. There was a lot of violence because there's so much poverty in Germany, and it really paved the way, the right environment for the rise of the Nazi Party. By slapping Germany with the cost of damages from World War One, um, the Allied nations inadvertently actually created the environment for the rise of the Nazi Party, and which led to World War II. So, yeah, not a good thing. Uh, the other example, as we talked about Venezuela, Zimbabwe as well in 2008. Prices were doubling every 25 hours, and inflation rates were at 65,000%. So you can see from those examples, hyperinflation is something you do not want to experience. Staying with the cost of inflation here, and we want to look at our interest rates. And the interest rate really tells us how many dollars we will have to pay in the future in exchange for having one more dollar today, the time value of money principle. And you should have learned that in business math as well. What we didn't look at in business math too much was the real interest rate, which is expressed in terms of a basket of goods, the rate of interest measured in constant dollars. And real interest rates is the real cost of borrowing. My example that I said about lending out that $1,000 and at 7%, if inflation goes up to 5%, well, then the real interest rate's only 2%. Um, if inflation rates are 3%, then the real interest rate's at 4%. It's just going to be what our interest rate is minus inflation tells us our real interest rate. So let's look at an example. Nominal interest rate, one last term, is the interest rate in terms of dollars. So, example: the rates printed in the financial pages of newspapers are nominal interest rates. So, if a T bill is at 4.5%, then the government promises to pay $1.04 a year from now for every dollar that's invested in T bills. Another really important thing here: when expected inflation is zero, real interest rates and nominal interest rates are the same, they're equal. So, the real interest rate, that's the rate of interest measured in constant dollars. And we just find that by taking our nominal interest rate and subtract the inflation rate. if we happen to know those. So, if you borrow a sum of money for 1 year at a nominal rate of interest of 11%, and during that same year the inflation rate was 4%, what real rate of interest did you pay? We can use our formula here. Real interest rate equals our nominal rate minus the inflation rate. So I'll give you a second or encourage you to pause the video while you calculate that out, and then resume it when you're ready to take a look at the answer. All right, let's take a look at the answer here. Well, we borrowed money at 11%. That's our nominal rate. And inflation was 4%. So, in order to find our real rate of interest, all we're going to do is take the 11% nominal rate, subtract the 4% inflation rate, and we'll find out that our real rate of interest is 7%. Last thing we're going to look at is types of inflation. So, pure inflation, and I'll start off by saying that while I do talk about this, pure inflation in the real world does not actually exist. So wages and prices increase by the same proportion. In an economy with 10% inflation, prices of all goods would increase by 10%. Wages would also increase by 10%. So why does the Bank of Canada care about inflation? Well, simply put, because pure inflation doesn't exist. In a period of inflation, not all prices and wages increase by the same proportion. In this case, if prices exceed wages, then inflation affects income distribution. And we've experienced that numerous times. And if you do work and you go and you get a raise at the end of the year, it doesn't always match what the cost of living is. Not only that, but uh, the prices of goods and services tend to go up well ahead of wages increasing. So, um, no, pure inflation just doesn't exist. In a perfect world, though, wages and prices would increase at the same rates or decrease at the same rates to keep our purchasing power the same. So, the true types of inflation, there are two types. Demand pull inflation is the first one that we're going to look at. And this is when total demand for goods and services exceeds the economy's capacity to produce. So remember when we looked at chapter 2 and we're looking at supply and demand, when we have a shortage of products or goods and services, um, consumers will bid up the price, and then as the price starts to go up, suppliers will start to supply more. Same kind of idea here. um, what happens is if demand is outpacing supply or outpacing an economy's capacity to produce, then uh, the consumers are going to actually bid the prices up. And that's going to cause an increase in prices of goods and services, which is inflation. So that's demand pulling the prices up because demand is higher than the economy's capacity to produce. So higher demand equals higher prices, which is demand pull inflation. The other type of inflation comes from the supply side, and it's called cost push inflation. And it includes three different types, but it's caused by an increase in the costs of production or in profit levels, with the effect being on the supply side. So, cost push inflation includes wage push, profit push, and import push inflation. Wage push inflation, that's when things like unions push for higher wages than production justifies. So wages increase, and if they increase in enough industries and an economy, then suppliers now start to, because their profit margins have dropped, they try to pass those prices on, partially at least, to the consumers by increasing their prices. They increase their prices on their goods and services, and that's cost push inflation. When the government increased minimum wage in Canada, we saw a little bit of that as well. Minimum wage went up, and all of a sudden, corporations, because their costs increased and their profit margins decreased, they tried to find ways around that. One of the ways was to increase prices, um, so that consumers were paying for part of that wage increase, and it wasn't affecting organizations as much. And that causes a wage push inflation. Profit push inflation is when large companies in sectors with high market control and low competition raise prices to increase profits. So, organizations that are large enough within an economy and don't have a lot of competition might just say, hey, you know what? We need to raise our prices to raise our profit margin. And so they raise their prices to increase their profit margin. And that's a profit push inflation. The final one is an import push inflation, and that's when imports that we rely on increase in price. And the best example of that is foreign oil. And what happens is when foreign oil increases in price, um, that increases the price of everything. If goods and services need to be transported, well, that uses gas, and gas comes from foreign oil. So, gas prices increase, which increases costs to organizations to distribute their products and services, and they pass that cost along to the consumers by increasing prices. Another, although it wasn't really an import push inflation, it was on an import. The carbon tax that's been introduced in Canada. Um, the carbon tax puts an additional tax on fuel, and since products and services are transported all across the country, especially in a place like Thunder Bay, where we get a lot of products and coming from major centers like Winnipeg or Toronto, um, well, that means transportation costs have increased, which means that are the costs of all those products has increased and profit margins have dropped. So organizations increase the prices and pass uh, those costs on to the consumer. And so that's a kind of a roundabout import push inflation. All right, and that is inflation. Hopefully, that made some sense, and hopefully, you follow along with the examples there. If you do have any questions, as always, feel free just to send me an email, and I'll help you out. As well, we'll spend a little bit of time at the beginning of next class for any questions, comments on inflation. Thanks for joining. Take care and have a great day.